Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are once again updating the Survivor 43 Power Rankings following the season premiere. And admittedly, my opinions of these players haven't changed too much from the preseason, although I feel like now we have a bit more evidence to support some of these opinions. But as usual, there are 18 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, we have the first boot of the season, and here we have Mariah. And I'm not too surprised to see Mariah go out here. I was pretty low on her in the preseason, and I felt like she was pretty much going to be a worse version of Marianne, who obviously had some difficulty early on. And it seems like based on what we saw from the show, as well as her exit interview, that Mariah didn't really play the game that actively. She seemed to put all her eggs in the Women's Alliance and then just hope that Sammy will vote along with them, which obviously didn't come to pass, with both Ellie and Sammy flipping on her, and even Janine voting her out as well to make it a 5-1 vote. And on top of that, she didn't get too much content in the premiere either, which, to be honest, before they went to Tribal, I was actually a bit surprised by how little content that she got, given she could have been this big character and they could have explained more why she was voted out. But with everything that we had, it seemed like she just didn't play the game that hard, and through that she ended up being an easy boot. So while it seemed like people like Gabler or Sammy could have been set up more for a flame out here, I'm not too surprised to see Mariah go out here, so because of that, she is here at number 18. And with that, there are 17 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win the game, based on their edit as well as their current game position. But at number 17, the person I believe is the least likely to win the season from this point is Dwight. And Dwight got an interesting edit in this premiere here, where on one hand, he didn't seem to get that much personal content. I mean, considering his background, you would think he would have gotten a bit more screen time to talk about his story a bit, but it seemed like a lot of his content here was not that spectacular, and some of it seemed to be even negative here, where early on he has his confessional about how he wants to build the shelter only to have the rest of the tribe not really know what they're doing, which sort of implies that he was the only one there who knew how to build a shelter. And then later on, it literally collapses on him, which probably isn't the best visual for someone like him. Later on, he obviously goes on the summit along with Gabler and Carla, and he does get a bit of positivity here by calling out Gabler's bluff and choosing to risk his vote, although even that is kind of undercut when he actually does lose his vote there, which I'm not sure how much of that is positive or negative given the circumstances, but it's still not great. And obviously the big knock is we don't really know where he stands in the game despite the amount of content that he's gotten, where it does seem like he's on the outs for the time being, where we obviously know that Justine and Noel are aligned. So I guess some of the guys are working together, but even then Dwight seems to be a bit of an outlier here. And I feel like if they were to go to Tribal, he could be an easy first boot off that tribe there. So I'm not feeling too great about Dwight, and I feel like his edit was the most actively negative out of the people there. He doesn't seem to have any storyline set up, which doesn't make me feel confident that he's going to win the season. So because of that, he is here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have someone who probably isn't in the worst spot right now, but they just got very little content in the episode. But here we have NECA here. And admittedly, NECA's probably in an okay spot for the time being, where she does talk about working with the guys. And she did talk a little bit about her immigrant background during the intro. However, aside from that, she was pretty invisible throughout a lot of this premiere, which to me was a very bad sign for her. And considering the fact that the premiere is an important episode for one's winner edit, I feel like that is a pretty big knock as well. I feel like she doesn't really have many storylines set up, and despite her being in an okay position, I could also see her easily getting on the outs. If Bessie were to go to Tribal soon, maybe she could be seen as an easy target as a result. And considering that we don't know much about her relationships other than her working with the guys, I could easily see them setting up a downfall edit for her down the road. So on the whole, I feel like NECA doesn't have too much going for her edit-wise, and while she seems to be in an okay position right now, I could easily see that flipping against her. So because of that, she is here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have another player who is pretty quiet in the edit. And actually, I feel like they're in a worse spot position-wise than NECA, although I feel like they have a bit more potential to move up. But here we have Justine. And admittedly, Justine is in a worse spot than NECA right now, where she is sort of in a duo with Noel, and it does seem like people are starting to notice that, which could cause her to be on the outs if they go to Tribal early on, which isn't great. And I also feel like her edit wasn't too shining as well, where she does get to talk a bit about her not being like normal girls, how she's a bit of a tomboy, but that's while she's trying to make the fire, which she is largely unsuccessful at. And the episode does seem to focus a lot on her trying to start the fire. It does seem to be a pretty big storyline for her throughout that episode. And while I guess she does eventually start it, I feel like that's not really something that's setting up herself up for future success, which isn't great. So admittedly, I feel like Justine is probably in a bad spot moving forward, and I feel like the edit isn't doing much to prop her up, but I feel like she got a bit more than NECA, and I feel like she is competent enough as a player to potentially maneuver around that, but it's just the lack of strong stuff going for her that does leave her here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have someone who's pretty similar to Justine based on their game position and their edit, but here we have Janine. And I don't feel like this was a good episode for Janine either, where she obviously bonded with Ellie and Mariah early on. She was technically shown as being part of that women's alliance, which didn't really hold come Tribal, and she never really got a chance to explain why she ends up voting for Mariah, even though she does talk about how Ellie's plan to focus on challenge strength would be a net negative for her, as it could cause a precedent that could result in her being targeted due to not being too strong, which I do agree with, and I feel like by Mariah going out here, that could set Janine up to be targeted moving forward as well. But she obviously votes against Mariah, which isn't explained, which I feel like is a knock there. And I feel like outside the intro, she didn't get too much personal content. She didn't get much in the way of storylines. But the main reason I have her above Justine is I feel like she did get to at least talk a bit more in the intro about her background. She talks about her father and how this is her father's dream. I feel like that's at least something that could be reinforced later on. Whereas I feel like Justine got very little personal content outside of like her connecting it to building the fire. I feel like Janine's could translate a bit more to something gameplay related moving forward. But on the whole, I'm still not feeling great about her, and I feel like she could be targeted at the next Tribal if Baka goes back soon. So because of that, she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone similar to the last two people we talked about. But again, I feel like they got a bit more content that could translate to future storylines. But here we have Cassidy, and I feel like Cassidy is largely living up to what I thought of her preseason, where I don't feel like she's in the best spot despite there being this women's alliance, to where if, say, Carla decides to protect Geo if they ever go to Tribal, I could easily see Cassidy being the backup target there, which isn't great. And plus, we don't really see much in the way of building personal relationships. I believe she's the only woman on her tribe to not have a personal relationship established throughout the episode, which is really bad for Cassidy's edit, and again, could set her up to be a potential target. But the main reason she's above Justine and Janine is she does get to talk a bit about how she's not going to wait for others, how she's going to play aggressively. And she even has that confessional later in the episode where she says she wants to play like a fox. She wants to be sneaky, given women can't get away with that the same way that men can, and how no one will see her coming until it's too late, which is obviously reminiscent of Erica's lamb to lion comment back in 41. And I guess Omer's owl in the night confessional from 42. And to be fair, I feel like that's the main thing keeping Cassidy as high as she is, as I feel like if it wasn't for that, Cassidy would be considerably lower on this list. But I feel like the fact that she at least had that potential storyline set up for her is enough to have her this high. But to be honest, I feel like in the short term, she's in a pretty bad spot. So because of that, she's here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we're going back to the Vessi tribe. And we have another person who I don't feel that great about. And I feel like they would be on the outs if Vessi goes to Tribal soon. But I do feel like they are likely to stay over another person. But here we have Noel here. And again, Noel's probably not in a good spot right now. She is linked with Justine. And I feel like if they go to Tribal next round, that her and Justine will be on the outs. Mind you, I feel like Justine is more likely to be voted out over Noel, given Noel's perceived challenge strength. And the main thing keeping her above Justine for me is, aside from potential longevity, Noel at least talking a bit about like her background in her intro. She talks about being a Paralympian, how she only has one leg. She wants to prove that amputees can hack it out here. And she does talk a bit later on about how Vesey is on the successful tribe, which could lead to Vesey being pretty dominant in challenges pre-merge, which, to be fair, a lot of people were expecting Vesey to win a lot of challenges pre-merge, which obviously could end up benefiting Noel. But I feel like the episode didn't really give much confidence for Noel's winning chances for me, so because of that, she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, I feel like the next couple people all belong in a tier of their own, and they're mainly people who I expect to be pretty big characters, particularly during this pre-merge here, and I expect them to get quite a bit of screen time. However, I feel like they don't really have a storyline to actually win the game. But number 11, we do have Ryan here, and Ryan is already being set up to be a pretty big character, as he got to talk about his cerebral palsy both during the intro and again while him and Gio are doing the sweat challenge. And when Ryan was ultimately the one to find the flint and win the challenge, he does get a pretty positive edit there. And I feel like through that, Ryan is probably going to be a pretty big character during this pre-merge here. Now, from a gameplay perspective, I don't feel like he's in the best spot right now, where it does seem like he's outside the core majority group there, which obviously isn't great. However, I don't expect him to actually be voted out. I feel like he's going to be a pretty big physical asset, as we saw at that first challenge. I don't really see Coco getting rid of him anytime soon based on that alone. But with that said, I don't feel like there's anything to really prop him up for an actual win here. He didn't really get any strategic content during this episode. A lot of it was merely personal. And while he is probably going to be around for a little bit, I don't expect him to really do much to get into the majority alliance. So because of that, I do have him here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have another pretty notable character from this episode here. But here we have Gabler, who I know a lot of people were pegging to be the potential first boot. He definitely seemed to have that set up here. And already we're seeing him being a pretty messy player, where he obviously risks his vote at the summit. Mind you, it does end up paying off, but not before he actually tells the tribe about the twist and how everyone knows about his idol, which is valid through the first two tribals. After the challenge, he takes full responsibility for losing the challenge, which isn't great, and then he doubles down by announcing he's going to play a shot in the dark, which is really bad gameplay right there. But to his credit, he is able to get the target off his back, though I'm not really sure how much of a target he really had to begin with, so take that as you will. And he definitely comes off as a pretty big character here, probably someone who is probably going to be a pretty messy player, someone who's going to be really aggressive, and it may end up overplaying to a degree. And given the amount of screen time he's gotten, I don't really see him winning the game per se. I wouldn't be surprised if he went out late pre-merge. But with that said, I do feel like there is enough storyline for him going here, like how he's talking about how he's the oldest on his tribe, how he wants to be the second 50 plus winner in Survivor, how he wants to navigate through the tribe to get around his disadvantage. And obviously we see him bonding with Ellie, talking about metal music, which does eventually culminate in Ellie wanting to keep him around. So I feel like that's a pretty big boon for him. So I feel like there's enough positive content for Gabler here to where I don't really see him being that early of a boot. And I feel like he'll probably be a pretty big character throughout the pre-merge here. But with that said, I don't feel like he's winning the game. I feel like there will come a point where people do decide to cut him, or he'll just make a really dumb decision that causes him to get sent out of the game. So while I don't see him winning the game, I don't really see him as the next boot off his tribe per se, which is why I do have him here at number 10. Now I'm moving on to number 9, and I kind of can't believe this person is this high, as I actually thought they had a lot of potential to be a flameout here in the premiere, but now that they survived, I do feel like they at least have some things going for them. But here we have Cody, and admittedly, I don't think Cody's winning the game either. I feel like he, again, is being set up as a pretty big character, someone who's probably going to be a pretty notable figure if Vesey goes to tribal soon, but probably someone who's going to be taken out sooner rather than later, as he definitely gets a lot of content here, like building the alliance with Jesse and NECA, to where he does want to target Justine and Noel should they go to tribal. He gets some weird strategic content talking about how he's a salesperson who wants to target other people in sales background, as he sees those people as being capable of deception, which is pretty interesting, though obviously could backfire on him. And he does seem like someone who will probably get his way if they go to tribal first, as again, I feel like Justine and Noel will probably be on the outs at the first tribal. But at the end of the day, it is Cody. I don't feel like there is too much for him getting an actual win here. And I feel like he's probably going to be a pretty prime target should Vesey go to more tribals in the pre-merge. So it's not looking too great, but It's the fact that we at least got some storyline for him early on, and the fact that he'll probably be a pretty notable character during these early episodes that does leave him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this is the last person in this grouping of players who will probably be big characters moving forward, but probably not going to win the game. But here we have Sammy here, and I don't think Sammy's winning the game if I'm being honest. I feel like he was undercut enough during the premiere to where he's probably not going to win. I mean, right off the bat, he talks about how he wanted to do the sweat challenge to make people see him as simply muscle, and then how he wants to hide his like mental ability, but then he's literally the one to solve the savvy puzzle. He's the one to offer the solution, which isn't great, as he immediately highlights his own threat level, which he sees as it is. He talks about how he's going to lie about his age, saying that he's 22 when he's actually 19, which could backfire, but it is something at least. And then later on, he is shown as being one of the people that wants to target Owen, and it seemed like Mariah at least saw him as a pretty key swing vote here, but in the end, he doesn't get his way. He votes out Mariah anyway, despite him talking about voting out Owen. He doesn't really talk too much about why he votes out Mariah there, which isn't great. And on the whole, I feel like Sammy got enough knocks to his edit in this premiere here to where I don't feel like he's going to win the game per se. But with that said, I feel like he probably has the most longevity out of these grouping of players, these big characters. I feel like he is kind of living up to what I see him as, where yes, he isn't on the outs per se based on his vote, but I could definitely see him being on the outs moving forward. And I feel like he could continue to get a lot of screen time even as he is being undercut. So while I don't feel like he's going to win the game per se, it's the fact that I feel like he's going to have the most longevity of these big characters that does leave him a bit higher here. So he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I wouldn't necessarily say this person is a winner contender per se, as I feel like they could still go either way, but I feel like they have enough positives to their edit to where I could see them being a major factor here. But here we have Gio, and Gio is not in the best position right now, as it does seem like him and Ryan are on the outs. And I feel like if Coco goes to tribal soon, that he could be the initial target there. And obviously that's not great. And even outside of that, I don't feel like there's that much of a storyline for him in particular, which isn't great there. But the main reason I have him this high is he does get content talking with Carla and building that close relationship with them, to where I feel like that could be a pretty important relationship on the season, to where if they do end up going to tribal, I could see Carla trying to make a move here to try to protect Gio, which is part of the reason why I have Cassidy as low as she is, as I feel like she could end up being the backup target there, but it also helps propel Gio to a degree. So I feel like a lot of his placement on this list is dictated by what I think is going to happen based on what we have seen so far, which is being propped up. But if it turns out that Carla wants to back off, stick with the women's alliance, then I feel like Gio could be the easy first target here, which isn't great, but it's the potential for him to get further in the game. And the fact that the edit does seem to introduce this relationship with Carla that could propel him deeper in the game, that does have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and realistically, I could see this person jumping up on future power rankings, as I feel like they still have a lot of potential to be a notable player on the season, but based on the premiere, I feel like there isn't too much going for them. But here we have Owen here, and Owen was a bit of a surprise, as I was expecting him to come out of the gate as this pretty big character, sort of like an Omer to a degree. But I feel like so far he's definitely coming off a bit more like a Ricard, someone who's a bit more subdued in the edit, someone whose content has largely centered around strategy and how he's complaining about the Baka tribe not really strategizing before the first immunity challenge. And obviously the fact that he was a target at this first tribal, which, considering how much of a preseason favorite he was, it would have been hilarious if Owen had been the first boot here. But ultimately we do see him having the relationship with Ellie, which does ultimately cause Ellie to want to protect him, and in turn voting out Mariah, who was the less active player at the end of the day. And I feel like the fact that he does talk about how he wants to strategize when no one else wants to, which in turn leads to him staying over a more passive player, is a pretty good sign for Owen in the edit. And I feel like that could allow Owen to build more bonds moving forward. And especially now that Baka has been the tribal and now people are playing the game a bit more, that could lead to Owen engaging with them more in a way that will make him successful in the game. So I feel like there's definitely potential for Owen to move up in this ranking, someone to be a bigger player moving forward. But considering the fact that his premiere didn't really have too much in the way of personal content, and also the fact that he was a target at this first tribal, it does leave him here at number 6. Now I'm moving on to number 5, and I feel like these next couple people are people who I feel like are going to be pretty major forces on this season and ultimately be pretty big factors in the strategy, but I feel like they're probably going to be taken out later in the game due to them being a big threat. But number 5, we have someone who I literally just mentioned, and here we have Ellie. And I feel like Ellie is someone who's obviously a pretty central figure on the Baka tribe. She was someone who was the main voice of strategy during this early vote here, where she was obviously brought into this women's alliance and was the main one advocating for Mariah to be voted out after the challenge, which is a bit weird as, again, she was turning on someone who the show presented as her ally. But ultimately, she does get her way here in Mariah going home, which is a pretty big boon to her edit. And it seems like moving forward, she is going to be a pretty central figure on this Baka tribe, and I feel like people are going to trust her a lot. She obviously builds a relationship with Gabler as well, which is a pretty key factor here. And Ellie does get her way in keeping the people that she wants to keep and getting rid of the person that she wants to get rid of here. And plus, she gets plenty of personal content as well. She talks about her story of her sister dying of a drug overdose, which obviously is pretty good for her premiere as well. So I feel like Ellie is going to be a pretty major factor on the season here, but I feel like it's a bit too blatant in my personal opinion, and I feel like Ellie is fitting the mold of these big players like a Shan from 41 or an Omer from 42, these players who definitely are going to be seen as early favorites based on the edit, but ultimately being taken out later in the game due to them being perceived as a big threat. And I feel like Ellie has a lot of potential to fall down that same rabbit hole and be targeted after the merge to a degree. So because of that, I can't have her too much higher than here, but to her credit, she has played a pretty effective game so far and was a pretty key factor on her tribe, and I expect her to be a pretty big player moving forward, but it's that concern of her being targeted later in the game that does leave her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who is very similar to Ellie in a lot of ways, and we're going over to the Vessi tribe, and here we have Jesse. And in general, I feel like the Vessi tribe doesn't have too many complex figures, not too many winner contenders, and I feel like Jesse is really the only person I would have in serious contention from his tribe here. But I feel like he's very similar to Ellie, where he has a pretty solid premiere, getting a lot of personal content, talking about his background, how he was part of a gang, but then he went on to get a PhD, and he gets plenty of strategic content as well, where he is shown being in the center of his tribe, where it seems like the girls and Justine and Noel want to work with him, but also the Codys and Nekas, they also want to work with him, and he's sort of left in the middle. And obviously, while they don't go to tribal in this episode, I do expect that to be a pretty key factor once they do end up going to tribal, which is pretty good for him. And in general, I feel like he is going to be a pretty big factor in the season. I expect him to be a pretty dominant force on his tribe. And I feel like if he works with Cody in particular, he could hide behind that for a lot of the pre-merge, which is pretty good for him. And I feel like he is going to be a pretty big player as well. But similar to Ellie, I do feel like he is eventually going to be targeted due to being a big threat. Now, granted, I don't have as much evidence to support that right now as I do with Ellie, given the fact that they actually haven't been the tribal yet. But for the time being, I am still expecting them to be in that mold per se. And with how similar their edits were, I do feel like it's only fitting to group them together here. So because of that, I do have Jesse here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3. And honestly, this person is pretty similar to these last two players we talked about in that they could still be a massive endgame threat. But I feel like this person's edit is slightly different. But here we have Carla here. And I feel like Carla is pretty similar to what I expected of her preseason, where despite it seeming like she could have been on the outs, I felt like she found her footing pretty easily here. And she is a pretty big player right off the bat. She gets lots of personal content talking about how she had a rough upbringing. She knows how to push through adversity. She gets put on the summit where she talks not once but twice about how she was nervous coming into this and how she felt like she was going to be an easy first boot, only to be surprised by how many people want to work with her, which is a bit interesting. It definitely feels like a journey edit on the face of it, where we've seen this before with people like a Suri or a Yao-Man, like how she does come off as a fish out of water at first, but then finds her footing in the game, which normally would be a bad sign for her winner edit, as usually that person doesn't end up winning the game. But what I do find interesting here is that she talks about this anxiety after she had already built allies and after she had gone through the so-called adversity that wasn't really highlighted as much on the show. So it's kind of a weird version of the journey edit where we don't actually see her being a fish out of the water, but instead merely mention that after we had already seen her find some success, which does give me a bit more confidence in that it's not quite as clearly a journey edit as you would normally expect, but it is still something that could lead to her being targeted later on in the game. But obviously, she was still a pretty big factor here, and she obviously builds this relationship with Gia, which I do feel like will be a pretty important relationship on the season. I feel like if Coco does go to Tribal, that they may try to target Gio at first, but then she could potentially flip the game onto like a Cassidy or something and keep Gio in the game, which if that were to happen, I feel like that would be a massive boon for Carla's edit moving forward. But considering everything that we know right now, I do feel like she will be a pretty major factor in the season. And while there are still concerns about her being targeted in the end game, I feel like they're not as blatant as someone like an Ellie or a Jessie. And I feel like there's enough distinctions from her edit from those two that does have her a little bit higher here. But I still feel like those concerns are enough to keep her out of the very top spot. So because of that, she is here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and believe it or not, the top 2 are actually the top 2 from my preseason power ranking, and it's just a matter of the order. But number 2, I felt like it was pretty close, but I did hinge it all on one small moment for me. But here we have Lindsay here, and yes, I did bump her down to number 2 this week, but I feel like this was still a pretty strong premiere for her, where she talks about early on her being a massive super fan and how she spent years preparing and that she has one shot for this. But then after they're losing the challenge for her tribe, she talked about how the game is harder than she thought and that she needs to be ready for everything. She obviously gets a ton of strategic credit for creating the Women's Alliance as well as pulling in James, which does again seem like a pretty important relationship on the season. And I feel like Lindsay should be pretty set up well here. But the main reason I decided to bump her down is one line from James, where in this conversation of her bringing in James talks about how he, as a chess player, likes to make other people think that they have the upper hand and for him to come off as a pawn when really he's the king. And to me, that moment was enough to knock Lindsay off a bit, as I felt like that was propping up Jane's strategic ability more so than Lindsay. And yes, there are concerns I have with James as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. But I still feel like this was still a very strong premiere for Lindsay. I feel like she's going to be a pretty massive player in the game. And unlike someone like an Ellie or a Jessie, I feel like she's less likely to be targeted later on in the game, though that's still certainly a possibility. But considering everything that I just laid out here, I did decide to leave her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 43 right now is James. And again, I feel like the main deciding factor for me was that comment he made in Confessional about him wanting others to feel like they're the king. And to me, that did give James a bit of the upper hand in that relationship with Lindsay, though I do expect the two of them to be working to get together moving forward, so there's that. Again, James is in a pretty solid position, and he had a pretty solid premiere as well, getting personal content, talking about his chess background. He talks about how he got into Survivor through seeing Earl Cole on Survivor Fiji, which was a pretty nice reference there. And he does seem pretty well positioned moving forward. And I do feel like that confessional of him wanting others to think he's a pawn will be a pretty key factor for his game moving forward, where he's not going to be out in front. He's not going to emerge as a big threat, but he's still going to be likable enough to get into good positions so that when it's time for him to strike, he can definitely do so. And I feel like that can be a pretty effective winner quote there. But admittedly, I do feel like there's still some potential downside as well, to where that could lead to him seeing people as chess pieces again, which was a concern for him in the preseason. That could lead to him making some pretty aggressive moves that do end up costing him some jury votes. But again, I feel like in the modern Survivor landscape, I feel like that's the type of gameplay that will be rewarded more so than anything else. And I feel like someone like James can still build the relationships needed to garner respect through that way. So while I'm not free of concerns of James, and I feel like there are potential pitfalls for him, I feel like this premiere was still very solid for him. I feel like he has a great trajectory in the game, a lot of good storylines, and key relationships that do make me feel pretty confident that he'll do very well in the season and potentially win. And it's for those reasons that I feel like he is the most likely to win this season after the first episode. So because of that, I have him here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings following episode 2, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, Big Brother is wrapping up this weekend, so after that season ends, I'll be doing my review and player ranking for that, so stay tuned for that. Amazing Race 34 is also running on the same night as Survivor, so I'll be doing power rankings for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.